Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. Let's begin today's session of the Comprehensive Hindu Analysis with the first article written by Suhasini Hadar, a well-known journalist. She here talks about the failure of the United Nations to take any action in the Ukraine crisis and how in the future also the UN is doing no good to its own image by not being able to stand against this aggression shown by the Russians on the Ukrainian people. He also points out that India, while being absent from the UN voting day after day, has also ensured that its relationship with the Western nations and with the Quad partners would not be the same. And in the coming years, we'll have to be prepared to be cornered in these groupings as well. The author here says that the Ukraine crisis will have a major impact not just in Europe or Russia but also across the world, including India, and how it handles its diplomatic relations with other nations, including the US. The UNSC, that is the United Nations Security Council, has been found to be extremely ineffective simply because Russia itself is a permanent member of the UN Security Council and thereby has a veto power. In fact, Russia has shown so much disregard for the P5 nations that it was during the P5 nations still discussing the matter that Russian President Vladimir Putin announced on national television that he is authorizing a special military mission, and the Ukrainian country was invaded at the time when the P5 session was still going on and they were still discussing the matter. That is a pure disregard that Russia has shown for the P5 and also underlines how ineffective and futile has been the UN Security Council in stopping any aggression in the entire world, even before the present Russia-Ukraine crisis. All the things that Russia has done, including targeting civilian casualties, ensuring that millions of people lose out on their homes, all of this goes against the UN Charter preamble. They have not shown any respect for restraint, being a P5 member, and thus the UN has not been able to fulfill its mandate of maintaining peace in the world. Now, if you look at it from the other side, even the other nations such as the UK, France, US, even their actions suggest that they themselves don't trust the power of UN or the purpose of UN. For example, these nations, that is US, UK, France, they also impose unilateral sanctions. None of their sanctions have been through the UN. They did not even try to hold Russia responsible in the UN using the other methods that UN Charter provides. They just unilaterally impose their sanctions because they also knew that imposing sanctions or having debates in the UN will not do any good to them or to the Ukrainian people. Thus, the UNSC has been undermined from both sides right now. Russia, in fact, has been so reckless right now in attack of Ukraine that they have specifically targeted the nuclear power plant, that is the Chernobyl, site of the worst nuclear disaster in the entire world, and the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is the largest in the entire European continent. This is where an interesting point of view emerges. That is, Ukraine and countries such as Libya used to have their own nuclear stockpile. So Ukraine, as you know, was a part of the USSR. At the time that USSR disintegrated, there were some nuclear stockpiles in nations such as Ukraine, Kazakhstan, etc. As per a treaty signed by them, Ukraine agreed to surrender its nuclear stockpile to Russia against the guarantees given to it by Russia, US, etc. that don't worry, you give us our nuclear stockpile and we will protect you from any future aggression. Now look at what has happened right now. Ukraine gave the nuclear stockpile against a guarantee given to it by Russia that it will safeguard it against future invasions. And in this case, Russia itself has become the invader. Now, what example does it set for other nations across the world? Now, do you think any nation would be willing to surrender their nuclear arms? Not at all. In fact, nations such as North Korea would be laughing right now because they are the ones who have still kept hold of their nuclear stockpile and they are still deterring other nations from invading them. And look at what Ukraine did. They trusted the guarantees given by the bigger powers and now they are paying the price for it. Now, the one thing that the Western countries have done against Russia and have been doing every passing day is to put financial and economic sanctions on Russia. However, if you look at the sanctions closely, you will see that some of the very important establishments inside Russia are still kept out of the sanctions. For example, Russia's biggest bank, that is the Serb Bank and the Gazprom Bank, apart from Russian energy agencies, are still outside the sanctions. Why? Because at the end of the day, the European countries are still dependent on the Russian oil and gas, and they can't put sanctions on the Russian energy companies as such. Thus, while they don't want Russia to supply oil and gas to other parts of the world, they want to cut Russia out of all the financial and monetary systems across the world, including the SWIFT payments. On the other hand, Europe itself has not been able to find an alternative to Russia when it comes to oil and natural gas. However, it's not that the entire world is boycotting Russia. Take, for example, India itself. Nations such as India, China, etc., will still continue to trade with Russia. India still is in the process of getting the S-400 missile defense system from Russia. It's not that we have cancelled that order in the view of what has happened in Ukraine. Similarly, China continues to be the largest buyer of oil and natural gas from Russia. Thus, it's not that these sanctions will corner Russia in the entire world and they would have nowhere to go. Russia still has a lot of places where they can go and sell their products and earn their foreign exchange. For example, the Russian banks, which have now been cut out of SWIFT, are now using the Chinese Union Pay for online transactions. Similarly, in the coming years, you might see a non-dollar system emerge in the world where the Chinese and the Russian currency are seen as the international currency in place of dollar. That is what the long-term plan of these nations seem to be. Yes, there would be impact on Russia and Russian businesses, as we have been seeing. For example, one of Russia's largest airlines, that is Aeroflot, might have to cancel international routes because they would now not have the supply of their spare parts, etc., that come from the European nations. Also, many of the European nations are cancelling the permission given to the Russian airlines to fly civilian aircraft into their nations. This would also impact the Russian economy. So on one hand, yes, there would be an impact on the Russian economy, but on the other hand, it would not burn down the Russian economy to zero because they are much better prepared this time around as compared to what happened at the time of the Crimea invasion by Russia. Now, the article does make a brief mention of the fact that Ukraine, under the guarantee given to it by the other nations, agreed to give up their nuclear arms. Let me tell you the exact history of how it was done and why it was done. Now, the Ukrainian Republic, as I said, was a part of the USSR, and at the time of their disintegration, did have a fair bit of stockpile of the nuclear weapons with them. Now, the question was, who would be the owner of these weapons? Russia, because it was a main successor state of the Soviet Union, said that we are the ones who actually own these weapons, so Ukraine should return these weapons back to Russia. Also, if Ukraine would have decided to keep the weapons, that means that they would have been a country outside the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but with nuclear weapons. Ukraine also did not want that because they always wanted to be a part of Europe and they wanted to comply with all the international treaties. And that is why the Budapest Memorandum was signed in 1994. It was called Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances. It said that Ukraine will be a part of the NPT as a non-nuclear country, and Ukraine got a commitment of its security and independence and sovereignty. So the world now has to see what example are we setting up for the other countries right now. The next article here is written by retired Air Vice Marshal Mr. Manmohan Bahadur. He says that in the ongoing Ukraine-Russia crisis, India must learn a few facts. First major fact is that any country is alone responsible for protecting its vital interest. At the end of the day, no other country will come and help you unless it is beneficial for them. We saw what happened with Ukraine. For many years, the Western nations, NATO, US kept on saying that we are with Ukraine, we will protect them, and we will not let Russia invade them. And now what we are seeing is, as soon as Russia invaded Ukraine, no Western country has actually come to the help of Ukraine. This has forced other nations which have a security guarantee from US, such as Japan, South Korea and Taiwan, to rethink again. Can they depend on a friend like US to come and fight for them? India also has had a similar example. In 1962 war with China, Russia did not really come for our help. We wanted weapons from America. Rather, America offered us logistic support and moral support similar to what they are doing with Ukraine. In fact, India learned it the hard way that we have to be dependent on ourselves, and that is why since the 1960s and 70s, we decided to revamp our military, as a result of which we were able to convincingly win the wars that followed. Be it the 1971 war, be it the Kargil conflict, etc. In between that, when India realized the fact that you can't depend on other nations, India demonstrated its capacity through the nuclear explosion in 1974 and then in 1998. Thus, India has already learned this lesson in the hard way in its history. That is why India is taking its steps very, very carefully right now. Steps such as not taking either side right now in the ongoing conflict. Now, there are many reasons being discussed as to why is it that India is not voting against Russia, or why is it that India is not speaking up against the Russian invasion on Ukraine. There are political reasons for this, and there are reasons related to weapons as well. Now, till the Cold War was going on, India was highly dependent on the Soviet Union for supply of most of its weapons. Once the Cold War was over, India tried to diversify its purchases and reduce its dependence on Russia for arms. However, the opposite thing started to happen. India, over the past couple of decades, has become overtly dependent on the Western nations for their arms. For example, most of the heavy lift transport fleet of the Indian Air Force now is from the US. We are dependent on the Boeing P-8I long-range aircraft for maritime surveillance. Then most of our planes in the Indian Air Force are from the foreign nations, including the Rafales, the Mirage fighters, the Jaguars, etc. And the latest series of drones that we have are from Israel. So while we were trying to move away from the Soviet Union, we entered the other camp unknowingly, and now we are dependent on the Western nations for the same. The way out here is that Atmanirbharta in case of defense is the only way forward. The Prime Minister also made a statement a couple of weeks back where he said that Atmanirbharta in the defense system is the only way forward to surprise the enemy. Because at the end of the day, the world knows that if you are buying Rafale planes from France, what exactly are the specifications of Rafale? How does it work? What weaknesses does it have, etc. Even a simple Google search will tell you all these things. But only and only when a weapon is made inside the country can you modify it according to your own needs, and you can surprise the enemy when it comes to the front on battle. And that is why the only way to ensure your own safety and security is to build your own indigenous defense sector, which India is trying to do. Now, our call for Atmanirbharta in defense sector is not a very new clarion call. In fact, it was in 1980s that the DRDO started development of indigenous missile systems under leadership of Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam. This plan led to the development of missiles such as Prithvi, Akash, anti-tank guided missiles such as Nag, etc. It was followed by the agreement with Russia to develop BrahMos in 1997, which is the fastest supersonic cruise missile in the world right now. Now, in the past few years, specifically, the Indian government has been trying to reduce our dependence on arms import. For example, from 2015 to 2019, 10% of the global arms were bought by India only. However, there was a decrease of 33% in our arms purchase from 2011 to 15 to the period of 2016 to 20. Not just this, the government has also increased the FDI limit to 74% in the defense sector to make sure that our own private sector also gets help from the foreign capital when it comes to making defense weapons in the country. Our own defense export has also grown from rupees 2,000 crore to 9,000 crore. Now, let me give you a bit of an idea here. We might say that a defense export of 9,000 crore rupees is a big deal, but let me give you a very simple comparison. One single battery of the S-400 missile defense system that we are buying from Russia is close to 3,500 crore rupees. That is one single battery. Now compare it with the export in the defense that we are performing right now. Yes, it has the 9,000 crore, but it is very, very low as compared to the exports that are done by nations such as Russia, US, etc. The government on its part has also opened up a portal called Srijan, which is an indigenization portal for the benefit of defense public sector units and ordnance factory to give support to MSME, startups, etc. who want to work in this field. Now, if you look at this graph, it will give you a very interesting picture. These are the nations that export most of the weapons in the entire world. The one thing that you have to notice is the most powerful nations in the world are a part of this list. US, Russia, France, Germany, China, UK, Israel. In other words, the most powerful nations focus a lot on their defense technology and focus a lot on developing weapons which can be used when the time is right. The reason why India is usually at the top of the list when it comes to nations that import weapons is because nations such as US, Russia, China don't have to import weapons. They make the top of the line weapons in their own country. So while India needs a lot of weapons, it has to import most of the top line weapons. We are still lagging behind when it comes to making weapons of the state of the art technology and the ones which are the most sought after in the world. So all these nations which you regard as superpower have this thing in common, that all of them rank very high when it comes to being a net defense exporter. The next article that we have here talks about the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that is the JCPOA, also known as the Iran nuclear deal. Now, just to give you a brief background, in 2015, P5 plus 1, that is the permanent members of Security Council in Germany, reached a deal with Iran under which sanctions will be taken back from Iran, and Iran will promise not to enrich uranium and not to build their own atomic bomb. When Donald Trump came to power in 2018, Donald Trump said that US will not be a part of the deal anymore, although the international agencies said that Iran is following all the limitations that are given in the treaty. Now that Donald Trump is out of power, the US and the other nations are again on the table trying to sign the deal again. The other reason why the US and the Western nations want to sign the deal is because they are putting sanctions on Russia. They want that the global supply of oil and natural gas does not get cut down, and they want Iran now to pump in a lot more oil and gas and supply it in the global market so that the prices can be stabilized. And Russia and Iran both know this, and that is why there are very interesting talks that are going on right now. While the P5 plus 1 nations are discussing revival of this treaty with Iran, Russia, which is a part of P5, has said that we will not sign the treaty unless Western nations give us a guarantee that Russia's trade with Iran and defense ties with Iran will not be impacted with the sanctions. So whatever sanction the Western countries are putting on Russia, Russia wants that these sanctions should not negatively impact Russia's trade with Iran. Only then Russia will be a part of this JCPOA trade. Now this is very interesting because Iran obviously would also want that. They would also want to trade with Russia. They would also want the sanctions to go away. So it's Iran and Russia on one side and the other nations on the other side. And it's interesting to see how this deal will go on now. Because Russia knows that the Western nations are looking for an alternate supply of oil and natural gas, Russia knows that they are in a very strong position to negotiate here. Russia in the earlier deal was a member of the Joint Commission that supervised Iran's compliance. In fact, under the agreement, the point was that Russia will take control of the excess enriched uranium from Iran and work with Iran to convert its nuclear plant into a research facility. Now, if the Western nations don't want Russia to be a part of the deal, one of the other nations has to take up this responsibility that Russia had taken in the earlier deal, because there's a very little chance that other nations along with Russia now can sign this deal with respect to what is going on in Russia and Ukraine right now. So the other nations now have to find a way out of how can we take forward this deal and bring Iran back into the global market. Now, this JCPOA, or the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, is also known as the Iran nuclear deal. Now, recently, as you know, US restored the sanction waiver that was given to Iran under this deal after Donald Trump had imposed the sanctions back. This agreement was an outcome of long negotiations from 2013 to 2015 between Iran and P5 plus 1. Here one suggests Germany and P5 suggests the permanent members of the Security Council. Now, what would be the impact of the ongoing negotiation on India? India is one country which would be very, very happy if this deal is back on the table, because it will mean that sanctions now will be taken back from Iran and Iran will be a part of the global economy once again. This will allow India to ensure that the work on the Chabahar port can go on again without the fear of any US sanctions. Secondly, we will also be able to buy oil from Iran without any worry from the US, because US had earlier asked us to minimize our oil and gas supply from Iran. Also, Iran is a part of the international North-South transit corridor, which India wants to fulfill on a priority. It will allow India improved connectivity with the 5 Central Asian republics. Thus, Iran becoming a part of the mainstream global economics is in the best interest of India to a large extent. The next article is a good news for India as a whole. The Registrar General has pointed out that the maternal mortality ratio in India has declined by 10 points. This is in line with the past few years where the maternal mortality ratio has been on a continuous decline. India, in fact, is on the verge of achieving the national health policy target set by the government. The MMR, or the maternal mortality ratio, has declined from 113 in 2016 to 18 to 103 now, which is about a 8.8% decline. The decline, as I said, is continuous and has been seen from many years now. The target that we had set under our national health policy was 100 per lakh live births by 2020, while the SDG, that is Sustainable Development Goal target, is to achieve this ratio of 70 by 2030. Many states in India, in fact, have already achieved the SDG targets, which is Kerala, Maharashtra, Telangana, Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, Jharkhand, and Gujarat, while the other states also are in line to achieve that target. The biggest achievement has been reported by Uttar Pradesh, where the decline is of 30 points, an extremely encouraging sign considering that the state makes up most of the poor population in the country. Now, maternal mortality rate in very simple terms is the number of maternal deaths per 1 lakh live births due to pregnancy or termination of pregnancy, regardless of where the pregnancy is taking place and what is the duration of the pregnancy. Now, there are a lot of reasons why maternal mortality rate is usually high in India and other developing nations. That includes spread of diseases, unawareness about how to tackle diseases, unawareness about hygiene, etc., lack of nutrition in the mother, unhealthy livelihood, hemorrhage, and incorrect treatment due to unavailability of experienced doctors where they are required. Many studies have suggested that most of these deaths can be very easily controlled and prevented if proper treatment is given in time to the women. Now, the government has also realized this and they have taken multiple initiatives in the past few years, because of which we are seeing a constant decline in this maternal mortality rate. For example, there is a Lakshya initiative which stands for Labor Room Quality Improvement Initiative. It focuses on public health facilities and ensures that the maternity operation theatres have the best quality care possible. Then we also have the Pradhan Mantri Matra Vandana Yojana, which is implemented by the Ministry of Women and Child Development. Under this, the beneficiaries get rupees 5,000 in 3 installments. We also have Janani Suraksha Yojana, which is a part of the National Health Mission. All these have had certain impact at different levels in the society, resulting in the entire number of the maternal mortality ratio coming down in the past few years, which is an extremely positive sign for India as the entire country. The next article focuses on the surge in the oil and natural gas prices as we have seen in the international market. Now, this is not a surprise for anyone. In fact, even before Russia started its invasion on Ukraine, the international oil and gas prices were extremely high. And after this invasion happened, it has even become higher. So much so that the international oil prices on 7th of March reached the highest point of the last 14 years, over $139 per barrel. However, since then the prices have been declining, and in the last week the close price was about 112.67 per barrel, which is still extremely higher as compared to India's average that we thought at the time of the budget of about $75 per barrel. The reason is very simple and is related to the Russia-Ukraine crisis and the sanctions that are imposed on Russia. Russia, because it is the world's third largest oil producer after Saudi Arabia and US, and the largest exporter of crude and oil products, means that when US and European countries put sanctions on Russia, when US says that we will not buy the Russian oil and gas from now onwards, that means that the global supply of oil and gas is now restricted. Supply is restricted means that demand will go up, and because of this mismatch, the prices automatically will surge in the international market. US imported about 7 lakh barrels per day of crude oil and refined petrol products from Russia, which is about 10% of its entire export. So Russia in one single day lost 10% of its export market of oil and gas. Thus, it has a big impact on the international market. We discussed earlier also how the European nations have been very careful of not imposing sanctions on Russian oil and gas industry. So the Russian supply of oil and gas will still continue for Europe and China, and thus the ban will not have a very severe impact on Russian oil and gas, at least immediately. It would have a long-term impact. At least right now, Russia is well covered in all its bases. Apart from the supply chain issues, the other issue that the world is looking at is the Federal Reserve of the US increasing its interest rates in the coming weeks. It is expected that once the interest rates increase, means the dollar will strengthen, making the import of oil even costlier for non-dollar nations including India and other developing nations. Thus, there are hard times ahead for those nations that import a lot of crude oil from other nations including India. And now that the elections are also over and we don't have the model code of conduct in place, the governments will not really think twice before transferring this increased cost to the end consumer. Also, just to show you an idea of how the price of petrol and diesel is made up in India. So in October 2021, the retail rate that was charged to a dealer, let's say for petrol, was about 44.4 rupees per litre. Then there was excise duty by center of about 32.9 rupees, dealer commission per litre about 3.9 rupees, then the sales tax of about 24.2 rupees, and then came the retail price. So of the price that you paid, 42% was actually the price of the oil that was charged to the dealers. Now, when this component of the price of the oil is increasing, obviously the overall cost will increase. The government might cut down on its own excise duty. The government at the state level might also cut down on its own sales tax. But most probably, you will not see a great cut because there are no nearby elections coming up, and the governments now will not take such a step. They would in fact look to fill in their coffers. So when this price is going up, the price at which the dealers are getting the petrol or the diesel, the overall price might see a big jump in the coming days. And it's not just in India, the Western countries are also worried about the same. In the international media, there are a lot of articles about how the oil prices are impacting the Britain market and how the British people also are very angry with the increasing oil prices. These are the articles we wanted to discuss from the Hindu newspaper today. A couple of practice questions. Number one, failure to intervene in the Russia-Ukraine conflict is yet another example of United Nations futility. Discuss. Second, Atmanirbharta in defense is the only deterrent that is guaranteed to work in the future against our adversaries. Do you agree? Elaborate. Both these questions have to be answered in 250 words each. Thank you so much for watching the video.